Hello and welcome once again to Storytime. I really enjoy telling Bible stories and bringing out meaning. I hope that you're enjoying this, whether you're a child and you're following the story through the Bible, or whether you're an adult. My prayer is that the Bible will come alive to you, that you would love to read it all the way through. And my plan is that we're going through the Bible together here. Well, last week we met the first king of Israel, didn't we? Can you remember his name? Saul. Can you all say Saul? Fantastic. Saul was the first king of Israel. And it was Samuel, the man of God, who anointed Saul king. And Saul looked like, didn't he was going to make a good king. Saul looked strong and handsome. On the outside, he looked good. But we came to see that on the inside, and God doesn't look at us on the outside. He looks at us on the inside, because it's much more important the kind of people that we are on the inside than what we look like on the outside. Saul was not a good king, and God was sad that he'd made Saul king, but he's going to be king for a long time yet. We saw last week how Samuel was sent by God to Bethlehem to choose, anoint with special oil the next king, who would be called David. And we saw how people look on the outside, but God looks on that's right, on the inside. And so we met David last week, didn't we? We met David. He was a shepherd boy. He looked after his father's sheep. In fact, his dad didn't even think about inviting him when Samuel came to the house, and he was the one who was going to be picked. Sometimes you might feel left out, but if you love Jesus, if you trust God, then things will work out for you in the long run. You do not need to worry. Okay, so don't fear, don't worry, it will all be okay in the end. Okay, so let me continue with the story. We saw last week how there was an enemy, wasn't there, of God's people, and he was called Goliath. He was the leader, the champion of the Philistines. Can you all say Philistines? Okay, and they were mocking God's people. And so it was that David, when he turned up, he stood up against the bully. And with his sling and with his trust in God, God used him to overthrow the enemy of God's people. And he took Goliath's own sword and cut off Goliath's head. And so you know what? That was the end of Goliath, and all the Philistines ran away. And the people, look, all the people over here, all the people of Israel, all God's people made a song up about David. And they sang this song. And whenever he was around, they would sing and they would cheer, because David would lead them into their battles. Now remember, let's put David here for a moment. There's David, and here's Saul. And you can remember, can't you, that Saul had given David a job. He was the one that would play the harp when Saul was fed up or depressed, and it would help him when he was miserable. David would play the harp. David would also carry Saul's armour. He was the armour bearer. Plus, he would also go backwards and forwards looking after his dad's sheep. So he was a busy young man, was David. He'd been anointed by Samuel to be the king, but it would be still a long time before David would actually wear the crown. He trusted God, even though Saul was still the king. Do you know what started to happen? Saul didn't like the song the people sang about David, because they would cheer and they would shout and they would say great things about David, greater things than they would say about Saul himself. And do you know what happened to Saul? He became, what's the word I'm looking for? Can I hear you saying? Jealous. He became jealous. So jealous. Now, I'm going to put David over here now. He's a bit bigger now. He's still playing the harp. We'll pretend he's facing the other way, playing the harp before Saul. Do you know, one day when David was playing the harp, Saul became so jealous of David because whatever he seemed to do, it seemed to work. And the people loved David. They cheered for David more than they cheered for Saul. One day, Saul picked up a spear whilst David was playing his harp. I wonder what he was playing. We know that he wrote many songs, and they're in the Psalms. And one of them, of course, is "The Lord is my shepherd." I told you about that last week. I wonder if he was playing that. "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want." Saul picks up the spear and he throws it at David. David ducks. He manages to get out of the way. But you know, that was not the only time that Saul tried to do that. That was really sad. It got so bad for David that he had to leave the town and the city, and he had to run away. So he wasn't playing the harp for Saul anymore. He would run away, and do you know what? He managed to find lots of friends who were fed up and miserable, depressed, and some of them in debt became David's men. It's a bit like David was an outlaw now. He was a good person. He loved God still. He trusted God. And he managed to gather together lots of people, and he became their leader. In fact, can you pretend there's 600 of them there? They loved David because they saw in David someone who was good or lovely. Not perfect, but good on the inside. So David had to run away from Saul because Saul now wanted to kill David. Instead of Saul and his army fighting against Israel's enemies, they started chasing after David because of jealousy. Can I say to all of you that are listening, don't be jealous of anyone, because you are special to God just as you are. None of us needs to be jealous of anyone else. In fact, you know what's amazing? Saul had a son called Jonathan, and Jonathan became David's bestest friend. They were like brothers. They were so close. And even though his dad wanted to kill David, Jonathan would warn David about the evil things that his dad wanted to do. Isn't that amazing? On one occasion, Jonathan said to David, "David, I know that you're going to be the next king. It's not going to be me. I know that God has picked and chosen you." And you know, he still wanted to be David's best friend. Isn't that amazing? I love that. But Saul got worse. There's David there. Saul got worse and worse and worse, and he wanted to hurt David. On one occasion, let me tell you what happened. Saul, when he's looking for David, goes into this cave. Okay, this cave over here, we'll pretend. He doesn't know that David and his men are hiding in the cave. Yep, they're hiding in the back of the cave. Well, when Saul came in, do you know why he went in there? Let me tell you. He wanted to go to the toilet. So he goes into the cave to go to the toilet, and he's over there going to the toilet, and David's men see Saul. They say to David, David, look, God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now's your opportunity to kill him. Do you know what David did? David got his sword and he crept up behind Saul. Saul didn't hear him coming. And without Saul knowing, David cut off the corner of Saul's coat at the bottom, and then he crept back into the shadows. And Saul left the cave and walked across a little stream. Then David came out and he held up the piece of cloth from Saul's coat to show Saul that he could have hurt him, could have killed him, but didn't. Well, Saul had a change of mind for a little while, and he said sorry to David. But it didn't last very long. Straight after, not long after, Saul is back after David, trying to hurt him and to kill him. Do you know, it's so sad to read about that. David still trusted God. Sometimes he was all alone or he was with his men. Sometimes they got into difficult situations. On one occasion, they needed some food. Now, let me tell you about a man who was quite a rich man. We put him over here. We put David and his men a little bit back here. Saul and his guys are over here. They're still looking for David. And this man is called Nabal. Can you say Nabal? Well, Nabal was a rich man, but he was a mean rich man. He had a beautiful wife called Abigail. Say Abigail. Great. One day, David and his men had protected some of the servants of Nabal. And it's now harvest time, and David wonders whether Nabal will share some food with him and his men. So he sends some of his men to Nabal to ask if Nabal will share some of his food. And they tell Nabal how David and his men had helped and protected his men in the past. Do you know what Nabal did? He said, "Who is this David sending people to me? I'm not going to do that. Tell him to go away." So David's men came back to David and they said, "Nabal doesn't want to give us any food." David was angry and he said to his men, "Men, strap on your swords." So they all strapped on their swords and they set off to Nabal's house. And David was going to kill Nabal. But Nabal had an amazing wife. Can you remember her name? Abigail. Without Nabal knowing, Abigail got some food and a cart and she went out. And she met up with David before he arrived. And when she saw him and his 600 men, she fell to the ground. And she said to him something like this. She said, "David, don't do it. Don't do what you're going to do out of anger. It is God who will judge us in the end. Leave it to God to judge Nabal. But I know," she said this to David, "I know you are the one that God has chosen to be the next king. If you do this, David, you will do wrong." I love this bit of the story because David listens to Abigail in front of all his men. And he kind of says to her, "You're right. Sort of way. You're right. I'm going to trust God to do what's right. I'm not going to fight in that bad way. I'm not going to try and take revenge." And he trusted God. I love that about David. Well, actually, Nabal died quite soon afterwards, actually. I think he had like a heart attack. And David took Abigail and she became his wife. Wow. Well, it's not long later that Saul himself would die. Sadly, and Jonathan, David's best friend, would also die. And when David heard that Saul, the king, had died, do you know what David did? He didn't do what people thought he would do. He didn't clap, he didn't cheer, he didn't say good riddance to him, he's my enemy. David cried and he wept and he was very sad. Doesn't that show you the heart of David? Because God said of David, he's got a heart like my heart. Well, it wouldn't be long after that David himself would be crowned to be the second king. David, we crown you the second king of the United Kingdom of Israel. So David becomes the king. So that's the end of this week's story. I'm going to tell you some more next week. We're going to carry on. And I want to tell you some stories of what happened to David when he was the king. But also, next week too, I'll tell you about the third and last king of the United Kingdom of Israel. See you next time. God bless.